Okay, hello everyone. This is the July 17th, 2024 meeting of the Vermont Climate Council Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee. We're going to meet from 3 to 5 p.m. today. There's an agenda and some materials up on the Climate Change website. Thanks everyone for making it. We'll go over the agenda and make some announcements in a second, but I'll drop that link into the chat just in case folks don't have it. Just a quick preface. As you all know, we did a Google poll to try to. Are you not hearing me, Andrew? Are other people hearing me? Okay, cool. We did a Google poll to schedule this in our next meeting. We just kind of confirmed this date, so we didn't have a lot of lead time. So apologies for getting materials a little late, and if this one's a little bit ad hoc, but we will certainly have plenty of time before our late July meeting and our August and September meetings to kind of dial in the process and make sure folks have more information sooner in advance. So apologies for all that. Hold on. Before we get going, I just want to introduce a couple of people real quick, or at least one person. Evan Horn is with us today. Evan just started on Monday in the agency's Climate Action Office as our lead on natural and working lands resilience, and he's going to be helping staff this subcommittee of Climate Council. So Evan, why don't you introduce yourself, and thanks for being here.
Thanks, Billy. Yeah, my name is Evan Horn. I'm the new Resilient Lands Coordinator in the Climate Action Office. Recently finished grad school at EVM in the Field Naturalist program, and just excited to be a part of this.
Great. Well, thanks, Evan. And we also had another member join the team on Monday as well, who is going to be providing administrative support to the council as a whole. So between the addition of those two folks, we're hoping to have a little more firepower to help manage our work going forward. All right. With that, I think we have to review and approve the agenda. Does anyone have any questions or comments about the agenda, a link to which I put in the chat? All good? Okay. Ryan.
Yeah, just trying to, open everything, unmute myself. Briefing on new studies, legislation, other relevant information. Request came in to review also kind of the basis, or a lot of the basis for the work that this subcommittee took on last time, which is the agricultural emissions greenhouse gas inventory. And so to review both land-based mitigation strategies and the analysis that was conducted last year, as well as an update to that, it's likely going to take a bit more than 30 minutes. So I don't know if we could verbally just say it's okay if we go a little bit longer than that, or how you want to approach that. But I can't cover both topics in just a half hour, unfortunately.
Great. So I think we can certainly make a little bit of more time. I think there are some other brief updates that we want to give in that section. So maybe what we can do is I can kind of list off the topics that I think the updated or new things I think would be relevant to this group, understanding that we'll spend some time with you, Ryan, touching on a couple of them. If folks have specific questions about the others, we can try to dig into them today. If not, we can come back at the next meeting with more full information and background information provided to everyone in advance of the meeting. How does that sound? Good. And before we move on, JL, anything you want to add as co-chair here?
Nope, just wanted to make sure Ryan had enough time.
Great. Okay, yeah, and again, folks, certainly going forward, our goal will be to get information out to people, at least a week before the next meeting, so that you have a chance to review everything, read it, ask questions, and be prepared to discuss it on the 31st. Just want to quickly pause and introduce Liz Amler, who just joined the meeting. Liz is the other Climate Action Office new addition that I mentioned when I was introducing Evan. Liz has a number of different tasks in her new role, but one of which is providing some administrative support to the Climate Council. So probably be seeing her here and there throughout our proceedings. So Liz, if you want to just say hi and introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, everyone. I'm Liz, and it's great to be with you all and looking forward to working together. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. Okay, so big picture, as we discussed last time, the charge that we've been given by the Climate Council is to review the initial climate action plan and identify priority actions for the council to consider highlighting in the update to the climate action plan. And in doing so, identify any significant gaps that may exist around issues that weren't addressed adequately in the initial plan. Since this subcommittee chose to put forward a significant number of actions in the initial climate action plan, that task is especially difficult for us. So JL and I worked to suggest some kind of some themes to help organize the work. And we discussed that at the last meeting. We shared that in the materials that we sent out. And today, in addition to hearing about some updated information that will be relevant to our deliberations going forward, we've also asked folks to prioritize actions that fall under that first theme and are pulled from different pathways in the plan. So that's largely what we're going to do today. And then we'll try to hold some time at the end to talk about the agenda for our July 31st meeting, and then getting meetings in August and September on the book so that we've got them well established in advance. There'll also be a couple opportunities for public comment, one after the updates discussion, and then one up after the prioritization conversation. Anyone have any questions, thoughts, comments before we get rolling? All right. Great. So since the initial climate action plan, there's been a number of things that have transpired that are likely of interest to this subcommittee that are either related to the implementation of recommendations that the subcommittee made in the initial plan or results of the work that we've done as a group. And there's also been a number of pieces of legislation that have passed that forward the goals and kind of thematic objectives of the subcommittee. And then there's been a number of different studies and analyses conducted that may have a direct bearing on our work. And I'm going to just list off a bunch right now and give a very brief description of what they are. And if folks have any kind of immediate questions, we can get into it. But as identifying them, if you could flag any ones that you'd like additional information on and maybe to discuss briefly in more depth at our next meeting, please do so. And Evan, if you wouldn't mind trying to kind of capture the ideas that people put out there. And then we'll spend the bulk of this agenda item having Ryan from the Ag Agency do a deeper dive into a few of those pieces. Does that sound okay? Great. So on the legislative front, I'm just going to run through some relative acts that have gone into law since the initial plan. There's probably others, but these are the ones that immediately came to mind for me. Most of these are from this past legislative session that concluded this June, but there's at least one from the previous session. And I'll start with that one. As many of you know, Vermont has a tax stabilization program for working farm and forest land called the Use Value Appraisal Program, also called Current Use. It allows private landowners to enroll in a program if they're engaging in agricultural activity or managing for forest products or habitat under an approved forest management plan, and they pay property tax at the use value of their property, not the fair market property value. So that helps people maintain ownership of large tracts of lands for agricultural and forestry purposes and have less of a tax burden. Our subcommittee had recommended expanding the forestry component of use value to allow enrollment of larger areas of unmanaged forest or forest that's, managed for an old growth condition. So that recommendation was taken up by the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation 2 legislative sessions ago. They made a proposal to the legislature to expand and create a new category for lands managed under certain criteria towards old growth conditions. The legislature largely moved that proposal forward, and there now exists this new category in current use for lands that meet certain characteristics and are managed for old forest conditions. So that's great. There's been some reports on how that program has been operating so far, and if that's of interest, we can certainly share that with the group in between our, before our next meeting. Any questions there?
Billy, I would just request that everything you go over, that you send out a follow-up email
Will
with
do.
all the bill numbers and everything so we can read that language.
Will do. Okay. A few other ones. This past legislative session, the legislature appropriated $1 million, I believe, through FPR to help support the forest products industry related to flood response. As many of you know, that last summer's floods were incredibly damaging on our agricultural friends. It hit really at a critical time in ag production, but the wet conditions last year also made it really difficult on the forest products industry and made it difficult to harvest timber products all throughout the summer. So $1 million was set aside to help mitigate some of those impacts and make that community more resilient to future flood events. So I will send some information out on that as well. Another act that was passed this session was called the Flood Resilience Act, or the Flood Protection Act. It was Senate Bill 213, and that made a number of regulatory changes that are consistent with recommendations that our subcommittee had made previously in the climate plan. It called for the expansion of permitting of development in river corridors, which is the area around rivers that have risk for fluid emission hazard. So there's already regulatory programs related to floodplains and inundation flooding, but this expanded state permitting for where rivers provide damage through intensive flash floods and things of that nature.
Hey, Billy,
So,
we're
yeah.
having a hard time hearing you. Your sound keeps dropping out.
Is that any better? Okay, we'll go
It
for
goes
that.
in and out, so we'll try it.
All right. I'm going to go off of the headphones and try to go just with the speaker, and let me know how that goes. My dog was making squeaky noises in the background, so I stopped doing that. But all right. So the Flood Protection Act, it expands statewide permitting for river corridors. It also authorizes the Agency of Natural Resources to create a minimum floodplain standard for municipalities participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. Right now, towns who participate in the NFIP do need to have flood bylaws, but there's not a consistent standard. They vary from town to town. It's hard for the state to provide technical assistance. So this will help create a level playing field across the state for inundation flooding, which is really important. The bill also changes the jurisdictional regulatory structure for many private dams in the state, moving them away from the Public Utility Commission and to the Department of Environmental Conservation. The hope being that the technical experts in DEC will be able to provide better services to landowners in how they maintain or remove those dams and assess them for risk. The last main thing that bill did relevant to our work is it expanded the mitigation requirements for wetland permitting, so that when significant wetlands and buffers are impacted in the state, there's more requirements to protect or create new wetlands to offset those impacts. So those were all consistent with recommendations of this group. Just a couple more things to hit on briefly. Legislatively, there was also a significant update to Act 250. Act 250 is the state land use planning law. At its highest level, those updates relaxed Act 250 oversight in areas the state has targeted and planned for growth, and provides tools to increase Act 250 oversight in areas that have more sensitive natural resource characteristics. Much of the details of that need to be fleshed out through future rulemaking proceedings, but that framework is largely consistent with what we had recommended in the current plan. It also provides some regulatory relief for forest products processing facilities, reducing some of the mitigation payments associated with agricultural soil impacts. And the last bill I'll speak to is the Renewable Energy Standard. While this isn't directly related to the work of this subcommittee, it is a large climate policy, so I'll mention it. And the state had, for many years, had a renewable energy standard that required the state achieve 90% renewable electric supply by 2032. The updated RES bumps that requirement up to 100% renewable. And it brings some of the requirement deadlines sooner to 2030, and it dramatically increases the amount of in-state renewable generation that's required to comply with that standard. So while that will increase the amount of renewable electricity we see, the pace at which that's procured in the state, it will also put increased pressure on our working farms and forests as sites for those generators, which was an issue this group grappled with a bit previously. So I'll send summaries and links to all those bills after this meeting.
Yeah, there's also the biodiversity bill. I think it was Act 56 or something.
Yeah,
It
so
seems like it's pertinent to our work.
Absolutely, good suggestion. So Act 59 is a bill that creates a vision and goal for the state of Vermont to permanently conserve 30% of the state's land area by 2030 and establish durable protections for 50% of the land area by 2050, with a focus on lands that contribute to biodiversity. And it breaks those goals out into 3 different categories of ecological reserve areas, which are effectively kind of wilderness areas, permanently conserved lands that are managed for habitat and other ecological functions, and then permanently conserved lands that are managed sustainably for extractive things like wood products and agriculture. It broke that work up into 2 phases. The first phase was an inventory phase that is just about complete, where the lead state agency, the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, was charged to inventory all conserved lands to see how they fit into those categories, and then answer a number of different questions about programs and policies that support land conservation and make recommendations on how to tweak them going forward. A draft report was submitted to the legislature on July 1st. They're still waiting for some refinements in the data and some public comment, and they will update that report by the end of August with the final version. The second phase of that work is to develop a conservation plan that will set the state on a path to achieve that 2030 goal. That is due, I believe, in about 18 months. And VHCB will kind of launch that process presumably this fall. So again, I'll share all that info for folks. And that was absolutely a recommendation of our subcommittee. And it aligns the state with other 30 by 30 initiatives nationally and globally. Last couple of things I'll mention. Earlier this year, the governor and the state treasurer entered into a partnership and launched a program called the Resilience Implementation Study, which is an effort to assess the state's highest areas of risk and need around resilience to help harden the state and make it more resilient in the face of climate change, and then to work to find appropriate funding sources to fund investments to mitigate those risks going forward. We're in the early stages of that work, where our agency is helping lead an inventory of programs and opportunities for investment in the resilience space. And then once that plan of kind of the priorities for investment are established, the treasurer will look to put a price tag on those and find funding sources for it. So that's some information I'll share with you all. And that may dovetail in another bill that was passed this year, referred to as the Climate Superfund, which directs my agency to assess the costs of climate change incurred in Vermont by fossil fuel companies that do business here, and then basically sue them to recoup those costs. So we're working with the treasurer to do that as well. And then lastly, there's been a number of different studies that were either directed by the Climate Council or conducted independently that inform our work. And Ryan is going to speak to, I think, some of them right now. There was one that looked at how agricultural emissions are calculated on a net and gross basis. And then there was another one that looked at how the state could better conduct a life cycle analysis of greenhouse gas emissions broadly. I'll get both of, I think both of those things are up on the Climate Council website, but we can get those to you directly after today. So any questions, comments about that before we hand it over to Ryan? Cool. And we'll get you all that info and have some time before at our next meeting for questions and discussion if folks have. Ryan, take it away.
Thanks, Billy. I appreciate it. Pretty comprehensive update. State takes climate action pretty seriously. Looking at the time of the agenda, I think my proposal is I will talk through the update on the ag emissions inventory report, and then stop for questions, discussion. Public comment is slated then, and then maybe before the next section, I could take 15 minutes to do the review of the ag mitigation framework. Just break it up into two parts, so it's not just me rambling on for too long here. If this is a overview, if folks have interest in more information, I'd be more than happy to schedule time outside of these meetings to talk about it or go into more detail. So it's a pretty complicated, this first part's a pretty, I think, convoluted subject. It gets a bit more linear when we talk about ag conservation practices and their mitigation potential. So this first part here is just a summary of the work that we've done on this front. So I always like to start with context, right? This is from 2016. About 80% of Vermont is forest and wetland. About 12% was in agriculture in 2016. Agricultural lands have been on a decline since the end of World War II. As of the 2022 USDA Ag Census, agriculture was at 9% of the terrestrial land base of the state of Vermont is used for active agriculture. We're down to 9%. The historic high back in the day was 84% of Vermont's land base is used for farming, but that was back in 1880. This is a brief summary of some of the major land uses in Vermont. As agriculture has dropped off in its production, there's been a recovery and increase in both wetlands. So both wetlands and mapped urban land use this scale over here. Forestry and agriculture use this scale over here. So as agriculture has subsided as a dominant industry in the state, there's been an increase in recovery of forestry as well as wetlands. And during this time, the most recent data that we have, mapped urban land has been increasing as well. So agriculture is the only land use that's decreasing its share of the Vermont land base. The contents that I want to cover, I'm hoping to cover 1 and 2 in just the first part before public comment. And then we'll follow up with again, it's a bit more linear, but just a discussion of what the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee did last year to review the agricultural greenhouse gas mitigation potential of different practices and strategies and what was recommended. So we'll cover that after public comment. I think, you know, the Climate Council was created by the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so a review of what's in the act is important to understand why there was a research grant that was put out there, or you know, investigatory grant looking at agricultural greenhouse gas emissions and how they should be accounted for. And there's a reason why it's of great interest to agriculture to understand this. In the bill, you know, in the findings section, we start off with a good framing, in my view, which is, you know, according to ANR, conservation and restoration of forest, floodplains, wetlands, and the promotion of farming practices that sequester carbon are critical to achieve climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. And so in the findings section, there's a holistic framing of the role for farming practices to provide multiple co-benefits. So I just want to make sure folks are aware that's in the bill. Looking at what I think one of the most significant parts of the Global Warming Solutions Act was, which is, you know, what you have here is existing law, the change to the existing law, and then what became the new law. They took greenhouse gas reduction goals and made them requirements. So anytime you're reading statute and it says shall means you got to do it. And so they took these goals and they made them requirements, and they set these reduction standards for 2025, 2030, and 2050. Digging in a bit more deeply, the framework that is used by the state of Vermont to tabulate emissions comes from 10 VSA section 582. And so this is a existing section of law that was not amended by the Global Warming Solutions Act, and rather the GWSA pointed to, this is the framework that we're going to use to account for these reductions that need to be achieved. Otherwise, the state is liable to suit if it fails to meet these reductions that the GWSA also set up. One thing I highlighted in purple here, just of interest, is a change in the language. The old law said, if practicable, using reasonable efforts, 75% by January 1st, 2050. The legislature took that, struck the review of whether it was practicable or reasonable, and made it 80% by 2050. So just calling that out as a change that was made. So section 582 directs ANR to do a greenhouse gas emission inventory. It says you got to look at agricultural activities, including livestock and crop practices. And to do this, ANR has been using what EPA offers to states, which is what's called the state inventory tool. And it's something that the Agency of Natural Resources has been using since they were directed to do this back in the day. So big interface between EPA, ICF, who prepares this for EPA, and then the state of Vermont as the user that uses this framework to calculate emissions for agriculture. And I just want to take a second here. Folks that are familiar with I just want to compare something that may be a bit more tangible than where this discussion is going to go, but looking at two environmental priorities for the state and how they were approached from a regulatory framework, right? So we know for the Lake Champlain Basin, there is in-lake monitoring that happens, right? Actual monitoring at the mouth of tributaries to understand how much phosphorus is ending up in the lakes. And from there, you can extrapolate, well, how much of a reduction do we need? And you can allocate it to different land uses that may be contributing. To GWSA, we know what atmospheric carbon is. That can be measured. And we know that it's going up, way up. But it's really tough to put a bubble over Vermont and say, these are how many greenhouse gases were emitted by everything in the state, and then how to consider what was sequestered in our forests and grasslands. It's a very, very complicated endeavor. So EPA does a national inventory, which is used in part for meeting the U.S.'s commitments to the Paris Accord, how we're going to meet our reductions for that agreement. Biden put the U.S. back in that agreement. So national inventory, which is then downscaled. So this whole big national inventory is downscaled to Vermont, which gives us the state inventory tool, which can be adapted by state with local information to better reflect what's happening in the particular state. But what we have here is a lot of modeling, and it's really tough to measure what the actual emissions are. So a bit of a difference in how these two resource concerns were approached. Again, bear with me, just trying to emphasize kind of where we are in this process for the GWSA, but folks will remember for the Lake Champlain Basin TMDL for phosphorus, it was disapproved in 2011, and it took 5 years of research and meeting and public hearings to arrive at an approval for a new TMDL that had reasonable assurances that was going to meet the reductions that were needed to have clean water throughout the basin. And so this is, you can go, I'll share this report, PowerPoint with everyone. You can read all these reports of interest, but needless to say, a lot of research went into this. For the GWSA, the goals were first established in 2006, published May 2022. In 2006, the IPCC, so this was May, June, July. So basically a month after they published this first greenhouse gas reduction goals, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published a new guideline for national inventories. And what this did is something we'll talk about in the future, but it was a framework that has not been reincorporated into the GWSA when it was being discussed. And it's something that this working group or the subcommittee has been grappling with since it was created. January 2020, GWSA was introduced, veto overridden September, November, the Climate Council started to convene. And right about here, it was identified that, oh dear, the framework we have in place to tabulate agricultural emissions in our greenhouse gas emissions inventory has some deficiencies compared to what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recommends. And so basically there's supposed to be this graphic of like, yeah, we're building the plane while it's taking off. But the timeline is running, right? The regulatory target has been set when the bill was adopted, and we don't have all this time and space to do the research that's needed to understand what's practicable and what's reasonable and what's achievable. So this is all to say that it is a challenge for agriculture that, well, I'll get into some of the details now. One thing to be mindful of, what this is all based on, is the fact that agriculture can both emit and sequester from the same unit of land. So we know, bovines, ruminant animals have enteric fermentation, mostly belches. The storage of their manure has off-gassing, which includes potent greenhouse gases, as well as the spreading of those manures on the fields and the use of fertilizers and lime have a greenhouse gas emission effect as well. However, that land through the photosynthesis and the growth of biomass and that wonderful process can also draw carbon into the soils and sequester it. So to review the state inventory tool as it's been conducted for agriculture historically, this is the current framework, which is agriculture is about 15.8% of greenhouse gas, of the state's greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont. And it's important to point out that the state inventory tool from EPA is broken into 2 chapters for agriculture and its lands. And this 15.8% for agriculture is just looking at the emissions. It does not take into account the sequestration from the fields that are being farmed, from the pastures, from maple sugar bush, from Christmas trees, what have you. those are not part of this framework. And so when you talk about agriculture and its emissions, and they say, well, agriculture is 15.8% of Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions. Well, yes, it is on a gross basis, but that's that keyword net, right? What happens when you look at agriculture and you allow for a greater analysis of the impacts of that sector on the land and the air? You got to look at the sequestration too. So just to, and we'll talk about who says why that needs to happen. So here is the breakdown of those emissions, right? In 1990, agriculture had 1.24 million metric tons. In 2020, 1.26. So basically back to where agriculture started. 49% of emissions come from cow burps, 26% from the storage of manures, 23% from the spreading of manures, and 2% from liming and urea fertilization. This EPA state inventory tool is an Excel workbook. So it's not an advanced modeling tool. It does have sophisticated modeling behind it. But what can be adjusted within this tool is very basic, right? So the number of cows, the number of animals, sorry, the type of animals, the size of the animal. If it's producing milk, how much milk does it produce? You know, how is that manure stored? How much manure is stored? What's the duration of that manure stored? And then the direct application of manure to soils, as well as the direct application of manure to pastures from cows dropping the manure herself. And so this is important to say that this inventory that EPA has is focused on just a gross accounting of agriculture. So for example, Maryland has at least twice the agricultural economic activity, but they have fewer greenhouse gas emissions than Vermont does because they do a lot of chicken farming, and chickens aren't ruminants, and so they don't belch methane, and so they don't have that potent greenhouse gas, and they have more farming with fewer emissions. So this is the trend line over time, taking those different components of the greenhouse gas emission inventory and kind of framing it over time. There's been a number of changes to the ag industry, and this is just meant to point out that this is a representation of an intensification in some ways. So in 1992, around when the baseline is for our greenhouse gas emissions reduction framework, there were about 300,000 cows in Vermont producing 2.5 billion pounds of milk. In 2017, we reduced about 50,000 cows, but are producing 200 million more pounds of milk. And there's many fewer acres of harvested cropland. And so there's a number of different perspectives to apply to this. EPA in their global analysis says intensification and getting more out of one cow is the solution. We know from looking at our ag sector, you know, intensification and consolidation has a whole host of other issues for the sector. And so when thinking about greenhouse gas emission reduction and what is the strategy the state of Vermont should look for, the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee last time spent a good bit of time trying to analyze holistic impacts, right? Not just CO2 equivalent emissions, right? It's trying to think about the whole host of services that are provided by that sector. So, you know, within the greenhouse gas emission inventory, it is just looking at gross emissions. And when you look at just gross emissions, it is just the number of cows, essentially, the number of chickens, the number of livestock, right? Those are the inputs that you have. And the only way to reduce emissions from ruminants in this framework is to reduce the number of cows. There is one conservation practice that is in this greenhouse gas emission inventory framework, which provides a emission reduction for agriculture, and that is digesters or biogas, the collection of biogas and the destruction of it, the conversion of it from methane to CO2, and the opportunity to generate electricity as well. So there is one strategy that is currently in the state inventory tool for Vermont, that provides an emission reduction. But we know there are so many more strategies that are available for agriculture, both in managing the livestock side and a lot of research going into high forage diets and kelp and grazing and manure management, right? There's ways to manage solid manure that represents a different emission factor than liquid manure. Again, more opportunities for grazing, composting. And then in the field scale, we know there's a lot of conservation practices that provide those benefits. So just to bring it back to the inventory and what this research, what this RFP was looking at, it is a analysis of the state inventory tool that EPA uses. And this is the section that currently makes up that 15.8% of the state's emissions being attributed to agriculture, is looking at Chapter 5. Chapter 6 is where the soils are, where the sequestration is, and that is not currently part of the formal inventory. To talk into why, like where did this, why is there friction? That's just a gross emissions framework, right? What's wrong with that? Well, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this is the last assessment report, AR5. So the same philosophy exists, the language is just a bit different. This was put together for the last time we did the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee. So just showing you what was shown to that group, which is IPCC says mitigation options for the AFOLU sector therefore need to be assessed as far as possible for their potential impact on all other services provided by land. Right? You can't just look at how do we get to emissions reductions without considering food production, food security, and what are the other impacts that farmers are going to see from climate change. They should be assessed holistically. And Ryan, what is AFOLU? Well, that is the sectoral designation that the IPCC uses for agriculture, forestry, and other land use. All of these taken together are a unique sector because there's potential to remove greenhouse gases just from the management of the practice itself. Very few other sectors have that option. You can't manage a car differently, or an internal combustion engine. You turn an internal combustion engine, now I'm sure you can make it more fuel efficient. You're still using fossil fuels generally to drive that engine. Cows you can graze, and how you store their manure can have a reduction in those emissions. And so IPCC says you got to look at holistically, and you got to look at it as the ag, forestry, and as a land use sector. The AR5.
Hey Ryan, can I just jump in for a quick second? I just want to quick check in. We're at 3:45. We kind of went through our public comment period because I don't think we have anyone from the public currently with us. If folks are, okay, please chime in. But just kind of curious what you're thinking as far as how much more time you're going to need to wrap up.
Yeah, well, this, like I said, it's two 25-minute presentations. I'm at 1942 right now. I got about 5 minutes to talk about the results of this. I don't think we can talk about agriculture and mitigation strategies without understanding the regulatory framework that is in place for agriculture and why this emission inventory report was what the first recommendation the group made it and where we ended up. And it's a good story. I'm just trying to provide the background. I know it's a lot of information, but I think everyone in this group, I know many have been through this, and I apologize. This is more for the new people. So it's about 5 more minutes, and then I'll be finished with this section of the presentation. So I do apologize, but I don't know when else we're going to talk about this, and this is what is essential, I think, for agriculture stakeholders to understand about what the GWSA means for agriculture.
No, great. I was just checking in, and I think if I defer to Jael and others on this, but I think we could probably go another 10 or 15 and leave that would only leave us with about a half an hour, 40 minutes for the other part of our conversation. But I think that's probably sufficient. So whatever folks think, but I think we could do that much more time easily.
Yeah, I would like to get you back, Ryan, to go through it a little more in depth. I think it is helpful, or maybe you can do an abbreviated version today, since we did already have the agenda kind of designed, and then come back next meeting and give a more in-depth overview. Would that be possible? Or maybe if we feel like, if everyone here feels like they need more, we can invite you back.
Sure. I'll defer to the group. I'm just trying to get the information out there so folks can understand on the work that's been done last time. And we, you know,
Yes,
I
it's
think
very
I've heard
helpful.
folks asking for what are the specific results. So I will move forward to that. All I'm trying to say, IPCC says you got to look at agriculture, forestry, and land use together as a single entity. You can't look at just ag emissions. You have to look at it with the sequestration as well. EPA took that guidance and they wrote in 2006, these changes will likely be incorporated in the next round of revisions to the SIT module. So this is back in 2006. They have not yet integrated this into the EPA state inventory tool. IPCC says you got to do this. EPA hasn't done it. And so what does this mean for agriculture? We retained, ANR retained ICF. They're the ones that prepare the state inventory tool for EPA. And we asked them to look at a number of different things, congruency with IPCC and other such rankings. So ICF came back with a couple of recommendations. One, SIT, the state inventory tool, is the best suited available tool for Vermont to develop a state level inventory. Okay, makes sense. Number two, to report a complete ag greenhouse gas inventory, ICF recommend that ANR report soil carbon emissions and removal from ag land as estimated by the LULUCF, along with greenhouse gas estimates from the ag module. So put chapter 5 and chapter 6, put them together. And in addition, they also in the report said ICF recommends Comet Planner as a potential tool to account for the impacts of management, right? So much of this, what I tried to set up was like management can affect emissions. So yes, look at the land, look at the base sequestration of land, look at the emissions, and then also you can apply practices in this way. And they also say that Vermont, we're a leading state at exploring means to customize our AFLU greenhouse gas inventory. And so now we have an equation that ICF has offered up, which is something we're working with ANR to understand how does this get implemented. So no formal, like this is what we're going to do, but this lays out a roadmap for how to get to net accounting for agriculture that's congruent with IPCC, which is take that chapter 5 of ag emissions, chapter 6 of the LULUCF, and the opportunity for Comet Planner or some other practice management accounting to sum those all together to get us to ag emissions. And so it's a happy story of you know, IPC, the contractor at least agrees with the IPCC framework. How this jives with you know, the current inventory and past inventories is something that needs to be worked out. One thing that I think is important to contextualize is that, you know, it's taken 4 years essentially to get to an output, which I think was apparent from the beginning that you need to look at agriculture from a, you know, a holistic lens. And during that time, we've lost 184 farms, close to 10,000 cows, and 72,000 acres of farmland. And so there's just trying to contextualize that as we have these discussions about tabulating, you know, CO2 and you know, greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, that there's still a human cost to action or inaction in these areas.
Hey, Ryan. Ryan,
yeah.
It seems like people want to hear more from you today, so we're going to just go ahead and have you spend more time on this, and then we'll really delve into the work next time. So you can slow down a tad.
All right, I will. Yeah, and I apologize, folks. Like this, I'm sorry. This is so. I make it so convoluted and so like wrapped up, but I will say this candidly. One contractor we were working with who does nothing but ag inventory work essentially is it's fucking complicated. Like it's agriculture in the natural world is just such a dynamic accumulation of different processes. To try to calculate it in this way is reductive and challenging. So in some ways, but we have good science and a good path forward. So I just want to bring us back to that's kind of the kind of esoteric work. So for this coming together of the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, I don't want to say it's solved, but the top recommendation was you got to fix the emissions inventory for agriculture. And I think all of the pieces are there, that it will be congruent with IPCC, it can work for the state, and it will better reflect accurately. It doesn't absolve the reductions agriculture has to make. It just gives maybe a better opportunity because you can count the practices that have a benefit. So a lot more detail there. Transition to, okay, if we're going to make and then again, this is also the commentary on don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? Don't stand there and act like, how are we going to count this? Who cares? We know there is a positive sequestration, net sequestration benefit from many of these management practices. But let's have programs in place that fund those practices on farms so we can get better adoption, right? We will tabulate the benefit in the future. And so just wanted to make clear, like most of the focus last time was on this question of let's focus on mitigation, not just emission reduction, because if it's just emission reduction, it's a very narrow set of practices that are available. We got to think holistically about how does the agricultural system, the production of food, what are options to reduce the net greenhouse gas impact in the production of that food. So you've seen this slide before. What Jael sent out yesterday was kind of the summary report of a sub-task group, is what they called it last time, to look at a number of different questions that were posed by the subcommittee. And so we broke down into these smaller groups and kind of really dug into these and brought it back to the big group. And so this is kind of a breakdown of what was discussed. Strategies, the goal was to identify and develop initiatives, programs, and strategies that reduce gross and net annual greenhouse gas emissions from Vermont's ag land and agricultural operations. These were the members last time. And this is the process that the subtask group went through, right? You got to make sure you're defining the terms so you're all speaking the same language. Want to review the existing ag inventory, review the existing land use change and forestry model, review existing programs that we have, and then identify the practices and programs that are going to have a positive benefit for reducing greenhouse gases. And then we also did some analysis as far as cost effectiveness, feasibility, and then some equity consideration. So what I will send out after this meeting is this set of documents that are no longer on a website because the website transitioned and so it's lost in the internet somewhere. So I'll pull these out and send them to this group. But the first thing that we started with was an inventory of existing agricultural programming, both state and federal, that have a potential benefit on emissions reductions or mitigation, which would include sequestration. And so this is a brief-ish document, but we got all the programs tabulated there that could have a benefit. We then spent a fair bit of time analyzing conservation practices that are commonly utilized in Vermont or could be used in Vermont and ranked them for greenhouse gas impact and associated co-benefits, the feasibility of implementing them, and then did an analysis of all of those practices. And this is a big old spreadsheet that I'll send around, and you can spend a lot of time looking at it. But what I'm going to do is summarize the results of that work. And I just want to make sure to give a shout out to Justin Peck for both the greenhouse gas emission inventory piece and this piece, because this is his work putting this. I don't know how he does it, organizing all this stuff. He does an incredible job. So 5C Ag Strategy Matrix document. The top two questions, right? Because it was so focused last time on emissions reductions, right? So if we're going to focus on emissions of greenhouse gases and then organic matter depletion, so soil health and emissions, right? These are the top 10 practices that came back using the NRCS quality criteria for planning a conservation practice. No surprise, right? The more woody stems you have in a practice, the better it's going to have on the reduction of greenhouse gases and organic matter depletion. So conservation cover, tree and shrub establishment, riparian forest buffer, cover crop no-till, nutrient management, rotational grazing. These are all top strategies, and for good reason. They're effective. This here is, we also looked at physical effect impacts for other considerations, aquatic and terrestrial habitats, aggregate instability, soil organism loss, as well as some water quality considerations. And so you can look at these different categories of management to see where they have an impact, right? Whether it's a reduction on the emissions of greenhouse gases or a reduction of organic matter depletion. So another way, benefits to organic matter. And so we can group these practices into different buckets, and we did farmstead, so work around the farms, cropping management in the field, grazing management in the pastures, and then land and water habitat management. So edge of field, riparian buffers, et cetera, that were grouped in that way. We then ranked them We then tabulated the existing implementation that has happened through state and federal programs, and came away with this kind of breakdown of a couple different criteria, and it lines up similar with some of the water stuff. So emission reduction coefficient, amount of CO2 reduced per acre per year, farmsteads and cropping management, pretty good. Grazing management, okay. Land water habitat management, very good. Why? Planting a lot of woody stems has a big benefit. But however, when we look at acres implemented, what are farmers implementing? Cropping management, grazing management, very little land water habitat management. Why? This takes land out of production, okay? We're gonna look at the agricultural sector. We wanted to focus on the production of food and how to improve the greenhouse gas impacts. And so big focus on the cropping and grazing management. When we look at total greenhouse gas emission reductions from these cropping management acres, this was the breakdown. So even though it may not have as efficient a reduction for cropping management, since we were implementing so many acres in fiscal year 20, there were potentially this many pounds of CO2 equivalent reduced from those practices. And one other thing to consider is the cost, right? Very cheap to do cover crop, very cheap to do management intensive grazing compared to taking land out of production and planting a whole bunch of trees. So this was just a way to frame opportunity around different types of conservation practices. This is something Alyssa White shared with us. It helps to emphasize, right, this is the different amounts of emissions for greenhouse gases and the reduction goals, what the emissions from agriculture would look like by 2050. And just some thought experiment, right? Here are some ways to get there, right? 30% reduction in enteric fermentation if seaweed ends up being a good practice. Let's say there's a 40% reduction in manure management. In addition to this, like, oh, okay, we're kind of getting to 2025. What happens if there's a 0.1% increase in soil organic matter per year on corn and hay fields? Look at that potential. And so soil health and soils is where the 5C group really made a recommendation to focus on, because there's so much potential. After the Climate Action Plan was published, Extension, Alyssa White, Hazarby, others did a state of soil health in Vermont and identified that there is the opportunity for annual soil carbon sequestration to provide the same as the removal of 200,000 cars from the road. A lot of potential in agricultural soils. Okay, so getting down to the actual recommendations and status update as to where we are. This is how last time everything was organized. We got a pathway, a strategy, and sub-actions. There can be multiple actions to implement a strategy or just one action to implement a strategy. These were the 6 that the 5C work group came back with. The first was to quantify the ag emissions inventory. I'm going to give that a check mark. We've done that. I think it's in good shape. 2, expand, enhance, and adapt and invest in existing state of Vermont programs, those that have agronomic and grazing benefits, methane and energy generation on farms, seed management, as well as riparian forest buffers and other natural resource restoration programs. So this is a progress update on how we're doing. So published in 21, these are the implementation that happened in fiscal year 21, 22, and 23. Lots of cover cropping, lots of manure injection, precision agriculture. These are all field-based practices, about 300,000 of them that have been implemented since fiscal year 2016, many of which have a climate co-benefit. Going back to tabulations, right? That was the opportunity in agriculture. One conservation practice can have multiple co-benefits. We know, for example, for the Lake Champlain Basin TMD alpha phosphorus, agriculture is doing a whole bunch of reductions with all those 300,000 acres. If we were to take and model using Comet Planner emission reduction coefficients for net sequestration for different practices, we're up around 12 tons. And that's just additional benefit in addition to the water quality work. The third recommendation was to implement a PES program, a payment for ecosystem services. That working group finished up and they promulgated the Vermont Farmers Ecosystem Stewardship Program, which has been very successful in its first year. 83 farmers have applied, close to 15,000 acres, and $624,000 obligated through existing agreements. So the opportunity to identify there are multiple co-benefits from that can be brought by farming, and this is a program that was designed to help compensate farmers for that. We also learned some very important information from that Payments for Ecosystem Services working group, which is 94% of farmers believe they have the knowledge and technical skill to enhance soil health on their farm, yet only 58% have the technical and financial capacity to do so. So thank you, UVM Extension, for this research project they did for the PES working group. And it just shows just how motivated and engaged farmers are. But as always in agriculture, the limiting factor is cost and profitability. Recommendation number 4, invest in farmland conservation that protects natural and working lands from development. We know farmers manage as much woodland as they do cropland and pasture. And we know within agricultural easements, 44% of all the land conserved is currently either in forest or wetland, right? So almost half of the ag easements we have are not in agriculture. Why is this important, right? We know climate risks are coming, extreme rain. We had flooding, significant flooding last week, major damage. We're not going to have sea level rise. New England is going to see lots of sea level rise, and this is where all of the people live in the Northeast, right? And so where are people going to move? Vermont is going to be a very relatively safe place, and so climate migration is really going to become a phenomenon. And this is from AFT, which is predicting business as usual and runaway sprawl conversion of ag land. We're close to being under 500,000, so close to 10% of ag land could be converted by 2040 to development. And so this is why the conversion of agricultural land is so important. Also, the food system is going to be, other areas of the country are going to have much greater challenge for producing food. And so one way to look at this is, how do we produce food locally within New England? How do we get to 30% production? That would require a doubling of land use for farming in Vermont to get there. But we know that, that's likely not possible. And so it's just kind of a thought experiment of the gap that exists to go from 21% food produced in New England, being consumed in New England, to 30%, right? It's a huge scale. And so that's where the preservation of land is so important. I'm going to skip these ag easements because I'm taking a lot of time. Education, outreach, and technical assistance was the 5th recommendation, right? You got to educate before you regulate. The more education and TA you can provide, the more farmers are capacitated to make the changes themselves. And then partnerships were identified as a kind of the underpinning of how this all gets implemented. So here are the 6 recommendations. These are the 4 items that I will send out at the end of this meeting. I apologize for going long, and for those that have heard me say this ad nauseum for the past 4 years. But I wanted to really try to, there was a lot of, I think, really good work that was done last go around that this group can build on, and that there has been significant implementation from farmers since the last publication of the climate action plan. And so any opportunity to build on that is also an opportunity. So I'll cease rambling. I'm happy to entertain questions or move right into discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. It's a ton of info, really relevant. Do folks have any questions or comments for Ryan on all that?
So I do. In that accounting, are they accounting for emissions from fertilizer production or just cows?
They're accounting not for production of fertilizer, just the spreading of it.
The application.
So any denitrification losses, yes, the application.
Okay.
So Louisiana would have the emissions for the production of that fertilizer, most wherever, New Jersey, wherever they're making the urea, is where that state would get tagged for that production. So it's accounted somewhere, but Vermont doesn't hold the production. But it's definitely an uncounted emission. But I think that's also one of the benefits of having such a livestock-based, heavy livestock agriculture base is we don't need as much fertilizer as the Midwest because we generate a lot of our own fertilizer here.
Yeah. Jake, you want to go?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Ryan, so I'm curious, in our strategy action matrix, the next step of doing that technical work around the inventory was to actually make the change to the inventory protocol that was established. And so the status of that was advancing, but I'm just curious as to like, what's the actual next step or need in order to make the changes that is suggested by the work that was done.
It's in process. We are working closely with A&R to take the ICF report and translate it into a plan of action. So that is still being developed. I think this, there's also some, again, the details. There's some wrinkles that need to be worked out as far as looking backwards at, because you got to go back to 1990. And so there's still some process implementation work that we have to work out. But as far as having all of the parts in place, I think it's there. It just got to be put in the right order and get sign off on that to one degree or another. And so for this working group, certainly if that's a priority, recommending that be done, I think it's certainly appropriate. But I will say, I think we're in a really good place right now compared to the adjournment of this council last time.
Yeah,
we're not there yet, but we're close to it. It's like a procedure and adoption, and that's the next.
Right. That was that's what I was wondering, is like strategically, if we only have so many things to prioritize and that's already, feels like it's in motion, has momentum, do we as the council need to elevate that as a priority, or does it feel like there's other things that we should be calling attention to, given the kind of momentum and prior effort that's already been established?
If you want my opinion is spreadsheet doesn't matter. The people being affected by flooding last year, this year, the wind, the freeze, recommending strategies that help address that is probably most needed by producers on the ground right now. And so focusing on how to make, good and recommendations that can be implemented to support forestry and agriculture and other, working lands. I think that's more of a priority, but I don't think we should lose sight of this thread, because when the state gets sued, this is the regulatory standard that allegedly agriculture is going to be held to. And so
right. we
do want to see that resolved to fruition. I think, so do we lead with that? We don't have to. If it's somewhere in, I think we should still, in my view, I think we should still make mention of it just to make sure it's not forgotten. But I think since it's just such a focus last time, I think it's okay if it takes not a front priority this time, because so much good work's been
yeah.
since the.
And we'll all be on call to make sure folks do what they need to do to establish that. Yeah, thanks. That's helpful.
Can I just follow up on that? I really agree
Listen,
with the importance of that happening. It does seem like a lot of the strategies and practices we could recommend are really predicated on whether or not they'll get counted. And so I would appreciate those of you, maybe Ryan, Billy, those of you that are more involved in what's going on in those conversations, if you could just update us if there are major roadblocks or things slowing down that would affect whether or not the work and recommendations we make would actually count. That would be really helpful.
Absolutely.
I'm having a little bit of trouble because Comet, and those things, they're not real. And so Ryan, you kind of touched on that. We really need to look at the practices on the ground and getting those in place and helping farmers change their practices are going to be what's really changing things. Worrying about the accounting, I feel like, is almost a distraction, but I guess it's required. And the tools that we're using to account, I don't feel like are really the right thing yet. I don't know. But I'm having trouble around those two different competing things.
It's a real challenge, right? I did water for so many years, so I'm gonna go back to water. If you can't show the public the results of the implementation, it's like you did nothing. And so if you can't track an account for something, do people have confidence in it? So it is a core backstop to all of this, but it does, the point stands. it's just a spreadsheet, right? CO2 concentrations are going to keep increasing in the atmosphere, regardless of what Vermont does, right? And so, like, we can't stop the fossil fuel corporation. So, like, the bifurcation of the administrative accounting that needs to happen versus the building of the programs, the implementation, like, they both need to happen in my view. And it's the best science we have. Like, there is a robust, you know, we should let Alyssa or others speak to, that they're actually scientists speak to, like, how robust it is, but there is some good science in how these tools are put together. I think it's more the political question of how do you account for these in Vermont, because they didn't evaluate how to account for agriculture when they set up the GWSA. And that was my point. Like, that's what this group did last time. And I think we have a framework that can be adopted and accepted. It's just, will that happen is always the question. But yeah, we need to do the implementation work, and we'll count it on the back end.
I guess I have one more, like, is there a different way to account, like just having all our farmers enrolled in, like, have a conservation plan and benchmarks in those plans that they're meeting? Wouldn't that be an easier way to account than trying to, I don't know, these other schemes?
Well, so exploring, there's 6,000 farms in Vermont, right? We 35 are LFOs, 100 and something are MFOs, and a few more CSFOs, and there's thousands and thousands of farms that are not accounted for. And so asking people to, there's just the programs that we have are effective, right? They're some of the most cost-effective and the most effective programs for implementing practices on the ground. And so identifying those programs that are successful, which is what is in the climate action plan. A lot of the agronomic programs that are at the Agency of Agriculture are what was identified. We can absolutely have a conversation about novel or different ways to track that, but that's always a challenge, right? Farmers are implementing something through state or federal programs, but they're also doing so much more. And, like, how do you get to that? How do you identify that gap without creating just a bureaucratic nightmare as far as, like, registration and reporting and the political feasibility of that, the cost of that, you know, like putting money to stuff on the ground versus tracking. Anyways, I think there's a really good service delivery model in place for the base agronomic practice implementation. It's like, what special additional programs for resilience are needed to give farmers the resource and capacity to withstand and recover from the climate shocks that are coming. Because I do think the service delivery model for agriculture is really good and mature, but if there are new practices and new programs, we're certainly open to that. So, you know, definitely if there are recommendations for new programs or approaches, but really the PES working group spent 3 years trying to talk about, like, what program would best compensate farmers for all they're doing for Vermont, and that new program is the best output that they had. So it doesn't mean there isn't a newer, better, gooder program out there. But yeah, it's would be a discussion topic. So yeah, I'm not saying we foreclose that at all. I'm just that's how it sugared off last round.
Ryan, question for you. Would any of these changes require additional sectoral reductions in the other kind of emitting sectors, if the way that we approach the ag sector emissions change, from your perspective, to reach the GWSA targets?
I think that is a great question. I think it depends what values someone wants to apply to implementation. And IPCC says, you got to remember, you get food from this land use, and we have civilization because we have food from sedentary agriculture, right? Like, and so if you want to have agriculture in Vermont, there's a physical limit to the amount of enteric emissions you can reduce from a cow without getting rid of the cow. And so that biological barrier, like an 80% reduction from whatever the total Vermont emissions are, you can't get to 80% reduction in agriculture and still have an agricultural system that's predicated on livestock, just with the emissions that we have. Like, even if you include net sequestration from ag soils and the practices, like, cows are really potent methane generators. And so, yes, I do think other sectors would need to have an increase in their share of the reduction, because I don't think practically agriculture can meet those reductions. And I don't think that and now, like, you know, I think there needs to be more analysis around that and discussion around that point. Like, it's yeah. So yeah, I think that's a glaring issue with the GWSA and its implementation.
Yeah, no, and thank you. And I agree with what you're saying, and I think, you know, all the points you make are good and reasonable ones. I just flag that for others to appreciate that. You know, there are kind of trickle down effects if we change any of these targets on other sectors, and that would be something that presumably the legislature ultimately would need to act on. So, but I think, you know, we've kind of traditionally advocated for this approach, and you know, will be up to you all to decide if we continue to do so. But sounds like based on today's conversation, we will. So. Any other questions for Ryan? That was really helpful baseline for everything we got going on in the future. Okay. Ryan, will you be able to share your slides with JL and I so we can get them out to everyone who was here today and wasn't able to make it today as well?
Absolutely.
Okay, I am going to pause quickly. I don't think we have any kind of members of the public here, but if there are and anyone wants to share a question or comment based on everything we've heard so far, please make yourself known either by raising your hand or just piping up. Okay. All right, so we've got kind of two remaining. So thanks for that, Ryan. We'll get you those slides. I will package up a bunch of information for all the other updates that I provided earlier, and we'll get that all out to folks probably, if not tomorrow, early next week. I'm out of the office Friday. And if folks have questions, we can reserve a little bit of time on our July 31st meeting to kind of follow back on those things. The other tasks we were hoping to accomplish today was to at least begin our prioritization of the first theme, strategies and actions. That theme was primarily focused on the sectoral emissions reductions required in the GWSA from the natural and working land sector. You know, I'll look to you, JL, about how you want to proceed here. We could certainly do that and begin that conversation. If folks think it would be helpful to reflect on the information that Ryan shared and maybe come back and kind of kick that conversation off at our next meeting, so we have more time and some more ability to kind of integrate all the information that Ryan shared, I think that's another approach, but kind of defer to you all on how you want to handle that. Thoughts?
I think we could start discussing the section or pathway 10,
okay.
But I'd like to hear what everyone else feels.
I think it would be helpful to start talking about pathway 10. You know, maybe a parallel process is, I put some things in writing as well. So you know, maybe we should share some things in writing and it gets summarized so we don't have to have each person go through their 5 recommendations, because that could take quite a bit of time.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion, Andrew. And I think in the future, when we do this, we'll have more time. And my hope is that we would set a deadline a week or so in advance of the meeting for folks to share their priorities in writing. Then we can compile those and get them out to everyone prior to the meeting so that we can just have a conversation rather than trying to share all the information. So That's certainly something we can do for Pathway 10 prior to the next meeting, but we could also start the conversation today. The other thing I would like to have us accomplish before we break today is to think about August and September meetings, so that we can have a better process to get things. We can talk about that when we talk about it, but we can either try to set those dates today, or we can agree to do another poll. So that's the other substantive thing I'd like to accomplish today. So with that, JL, do you have thoughts on Pathway 10 you want to kind of kick us off with?
I mean, I have lots of thoughts. I mean, I think a lot what Ryan said is important. What I felt like was really missing, I guess I'm going to start with the gaps, is like, there's I wish these were all numbered because it makes it hard to, but I guess it's number 4, implement edge of field practices that increase herbaceous and woody vegetation, riparian buffers. Basically, for farmers to do that, they're going to lose productive field. And so I'm in support of this practice and implementing this, but at the same time, we have to talk about how we're going to compensate farmers for that loss of land and production. And I don't really see that anywhere in, like, clearly, besides some PES stuff, but really clearly spelled out how that's going to happen. And so that's where I feel like there's some gaps. And I'd also like to suggest that nut trees are included in those riparian buffers as like a food source for wildlife and humans. And, that's allowed in those plantings. So I think that's a good practice, is like Ryan showed, that sequesters a lot more carbon. Those woody vegetation has good potential, but it also protects water. It reduces flooding impacts. There's a lot of benefits from that. I had questions about number 3, which I actually would say we could remove, but I'm concerned about no-till and what it actually does to soil organisms when you're spraying a lot of chemicals. So I think we need to have a clear definition of what we mean by no-till. Is that, just spraying a lot of herbicide, or what does that really entail? And I don't know. So if Ryan or a list of people who were on the committee, the subcommittee, could speak to that, that would be helpful. You're muted, Alyssa.
I apologize. I'm trying to make sure that I'm on the same document with the numbers. Is this the spreadsheet with the pathways and actions on it? And the third one is implement agronomic practices that reduce tillage and increase vegetative cover, is the spreadsheet?
Yes.
Yeah. So we, I guess the first thing I want to make sure we mention is that, at least in our conversations last time, we were supposed to kind of prioritize strategies, but we weren't tasked with like figuring out which program or department would pay for them. It wasn't the assumption that the state of Vermont would pay for all of the actions we prioritized. The hope was that because the state has limited funding, that we could identify things that need to happen and then prioritize certain things that maybe the state could find funding for, and things that maybe we'd partner with NRCS on or find other partners for. And others that were there, I would love your input on that. But my memory was that it was kind of broad strokes. So like we weren't getting into restricting like what specific types of species would be on there, but really trying to get towards like broader strategies rather than the super details. And I think it's valuable to capture the nuances that we can in the documents, so the path is there for the future. But my impression was that we're kind of like a little bit more broader strokes, and so we didn't talk about what type of termination you're using for no-till, whether it's a roller crimper or herbicides. Yeah, is that helpful?
Yes. I know NRCS doesn't allow nut trees in the riparian buffer programs that they fund.
The CREP doesn't allow for productive harvesting once the buffer is established. And so there's an obstacle we can't overcome with that funding stream, but it is one that does compensate farmers for the loss of the productive use of that in multiple different ways. If you dig into on page 112, 113 of the initial climate action plan, so my initial comment was just each one of, so the status, the one I have, it says it's advancing. These should all be being implemented because there's a specific, each one has a specific program at HC of Ag that's being implemented. And if you look, I'm just trying to underline Alyssa's point about it wasn't prescriptive about, you must do this, but it was rather identifying the opportunity for cost-effective emission reductions or net sequestration from the adoption of both cover crop and reduced tillage, right? Anytime you're reducing the tillage of the soils, you're conserving some more of that organic matter to some degree or another. So yeah, that was kind of like the broad strokes that were utilized. It's just reducing tillage and increasing vegetative cover as general principles to help get towards mitigation benefits.
I think we could cap.
I know this question has been asked before, but what exactly we mean by advancing or more information needed or completed, and I know, Billy, you sent that out, but it still wasn't entirely clear to me, and I'm sure other members of this subcommittee feel the same way. So I don't know if one of you could just go over that again.
Yeah, let me, I think I have a more detailed tracking document that has all that from the Climate Council website. I just put in the chat. And I believe on this one, there is a tab at the very end that has definitions. So that will help. My understanding is that this was not an exhaustive effort. Like, this was a crowdsourced effort to try to get this progress determination, that the climate office reached out to the kind of lead implementer that was identified in the initial climate action plan and asked them to provide an update for all of the actions that fell under their purview based on the definitions that were provided. So it's not, there's likely inconsistency in how people responded. It's not super granular. My recommendation would be, if there's things that are important to people, we have over 150 potential actions that fall under our work in the initial plan. As we're developing priorities, if there's ones that we have questions about and we want a more concrete determination of where they stand or what needs to be done to move them forward more effectively, I think we can get that information. But I don't know that there's anything that's kind of more complete than the document that I just put in the chat.
Just two kind of reflections on what was just brought up. I was noticing more so this time around that like agroforestry kind of has more of a almost like an umbrella element to it that we could perhaps think about things from. CREP is like a type of agroforestry with certain restrictions based on federal programming and funding. We had a specific there is a specific action about implementing agroforestry and silvopasture practices. And then there's others around, increasing vegetative cover. So I felt like there was a lot of overlapping elements that spoke to agroforestry more than I realized the first time around. And I think perhaps there's been more acceptance of that term and the use of that term in policy conversation. So that was just one thing I'm noticing. And so there then might be, some sub elements that kind of fall under the elevation of like investing in agroforestry and kind of having a more coherent approach to agroforestry policy in Vermont as it relates to climate change. So that's one thing. And then just like, in terms of prioritizing some of these things too, like the edge of field practices, the notes in the document that Billy shared said that a change in federal policy will increase eligibility. I don't know what that change would be, and that additional funding will be needed as the backlog of projects move to contract signing and implementation. So one thing I'm curious about is like how much additional funding is needed. We're talking about $1 million, $10 million. So I just like, and I think that's some of the opportunity here too, is like for us to maybe just understand the resource need and with that also like the scale and scope of potential impact. Because if there is a significant backlog, getting those projects implemented would have what kind of impact on climate, our goals for whether it's mitigation, resilience, adaptation. So like those are some of the details that I'm like wanting to understand more as I think about how we prioritize things.
So Jake, would that look like we fund a certain number of practices that result in X number of acres? If we shared like the amount of applications we get and the total requests and the amount unfunded in different categories for different practices, would that help answer that in part?
Yeah.
And I think, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and then I think from what you were sharing in your presentation, Ryan, was like drawing some equivalency of what are the either sequestration or emissions reduction or co-benefits related to water quality and or how we consider what we're thinking about when we think about resilience and adaptation. So to the best of our abilities that we can make those like projections or conversions, I think helps. I think helps in our process of like trying to do comparative analysis between these things and also just thinking about like how to then communicate to legislators, policymakers, why these have been elevated as priorities, and what really the need is from them or others.
I think that would really help. And I'll just add on, we'll have to reach out to NRCS Vermont as they're really the implementer for agroforestry and their kind of 5 different practice approaches. So I can reach out to them and ask specifically about the applications they've gotten for those through the practices and share that with the group.
Cool. Thanks.
I had one more comment in terms of the implement methane capture and energy generation on farms. I just feel like anaerobic digesters aren't really practical. Well, the ones that NRCS is currently, the large ones, aren't practical for Vermont. Because we have only a few large dairy farms, and if there could be a smaller version, and I don't know if that technology is out there for smaller farms, I think it would work better. But how it's set up currently, I don't think is very practical.
Yeah, that's, I don't know if this is open response from Ryan, but this is how I do all day, and so I'm happy to respond to that if you'd like me to, or I can keep my mouth shut, whatever.
No, you can respond. I mean, I think anyone should respond. This is my my critique of these strategies and pathway to and you know.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's absolutely the issue with the technology that exists. Is you have to be a large farm to have the professional capacity to manage this genset that is running on dirty gas and getting it to the grid. Like, to be a small farmer and then to also, not on top of your regular tractors and everything else you're dealing with, have this whole complicated system, like it's really not feasible. And so we've you know, there are some small generators, that technologies that Jim Muir is working on. He's got some REAP grants with these farms, and so we're going to see some medium to new small scale technologies come online, and so that's an opportunity. But as far as reaching scale, there's only 14 digesters in Vermont. They're all on large farms except for one, right? And that's just been the historic implementation, those that have the capital and the capacity to manage them. There have been some smaller farms that got digesters as a part of that original 2007, 2006 push. All of them have not been able to run it because of the challenges of running a small farm. And so finding a solution there, I think when we think about renewable energy generation and rural communities, the opportunity for, RNG is definitely one, in pipeline gas, but also heat, right? Like, if you can have a community heat system, that's something that Europe does well with their dairy farms and their methane capture. So there's a lot of directions to go with this. It's the cost of it relative to, so much of it is experimental. And so I can share an update on the grants and stuff we're working on there, but your comments are pretty much spot on as to why we don't have digesters on small farms in Vermont. The technology just isn't there, and the service delivery model is not there either.
So would then that mean that, like, this is a recommendation that, or a strategy that we don't want to really push because it's really not practical? I mean, it feels like this has been, anaerobic digesters are touted throughout the plan as, a way to mitigate emissions, but in reality, it's going to be difficult to implement. I mean, just looking at the feasibility, are three kind of benchmarks for this. It doesn't feel like it meets that feasibility standard.
Well, there are, 14 digesters online, and that's a discussion we should have, right? No reason to regurgitate what happened last time. I do think it's an important strategy for Vermont to consider. 25 million kilowatt hours generated a year of electricity plus an RNG facility, right? Like, those are real. That's real energy. That's not a fossil fuel based energy source. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and how do you make it accessible or scale it down? I think could be part of the conversation as well. But
yeah, I want to let Steven jump in here, and I just want to give one framing comment. So the initial climate action plan, the ag and ecosystems recommendations were very broad and inclusive, and all of those will carry on into the next plan. Those don't go away. So we're not, unless there's something that we think is really a bad idea, we can speak to that. But I think really what the council has asked of us is to kind of elevate the real priorities amongst the existing recommendations to push forward. So I think for something like digesters, there may be an opportunity there. It's not going to go away, but that may not be one that we identify as our top 10 list or whatever. So Stephen, please.
Thank you. And Ryan, I've heard you do that report more than once already, and I probably need to hear it another 3 times to really digest it all. So thank you so much for that. That was really excellent. I'll just throw in a couple of comments in response. One, I think, is that moving in the direction of the methane digesters is kind of in contraposition to the recommendation to promote intensive management grazing, because on the one hand, the methane digesters are applicable to more of a CAFO style large farm model. And grazing can be part of a large farm model, but not with the confinement necessary to capture all the manure and not have animals out on the land. I think in terms of no-till, I certainly share Jael's concern about the dependence on glyphosate to make that a viable option right now. And Alyssa mentioned that there are developing technologies for doing that in a more organic fashion with roller crimpers and other methods of termination. And one of the things that just constantly occurs to me in these discussions is, wouldn't it be amazing if we had UBM sponsored pilot farms in each of the major watersheds to be trialing many of these recommendations of the 10 pathways, so we could really be seeing how they apply within the regional microclimates of the state, and where they could have the best effect accordingly. Another thought in response to something Jael said was, one recommendation that I think could have some traction in conjunction with Act 59 and with the Feeding New England by 30% by 2030 would be to also aim for organic certification in the state at a level of 30% by 2030. That would be kind of echoing what's the EU has set a target of 25% of their agriculture under organic certification by 2030. So just throwing that out as something to consider as another recommendation within how we move towards a more agroecological model in the state, and wider adoption of these practices, which are most of which are embedded already within organic certification. Just to share, and I'll wrap up here, on our farm, we are managing 60 agricultural acres on a conserved property of 270 total, with the balance being in forest, which is also under ecological forest management. We've been going pretty deeply into the direction of embracing agroforestry through some incentives, one through a share grant with interlaced commons, and also through our engagement in the conservation stewardship program. But I would say that, and so that's involving the alley cropping, riparian buffers, silvopasture projects. But this is all really long-term thinking, and not to pat ourselves on our backs, but we're embracing it because we really believe that the path forward is that production farms can be fully engaged also in landscape function restoration and return enhancement of biodiversity. But in order to do this, we really create more work for ourselves, even with whatever money or technical assistance we're receiving. In the long run, it's really costing us more labor and more planning, more and it's really long-term thinking, especially when you're talking about putting in alley cropping with fruit and nut trees, or envisioning a silver pasture implementation that will take 25 to 30 years to really bear fruit, so to speak. So how are we going to ensure that farmers can earn a Vermont living wage, be productive in our practices, and embrace these really innovative and necessary and visionary movements of agroforestry and agroecology? And again, I come back to me, it seems very clear that we need some kind of guaranteed income for farmers. And that doesn't mean it has to be in the form of direct payments from the state, but it could be an amalgamation of the monies that are coming in from all these various programs through the AFM, USDA, NRCS, NGOs, but also looking at regional supply management, price supports, kind of, some of the old New Deal ideas for how to keep farmers afloat, but we really need to come up with some strategy to ensure that Vermont farmers can earn a Vermont living wage. I've been farming in the region since 1996, and I love it, and I'm still deeply committed to it, but I'm 63 and I am the average age of a farmer in the state of Vermont. Young people are attracted to this. They're working around the edges of it, but in many cases, they're going to go into NSCS or an NGO or work for NOFA Vermont because they recognize that I can't actually make a living as a farmer. And so this, I know, is our basic conundrum, but all of these incredible pathways will not be implemented if we don't have young people feeling like, yes, I can make a living doing this.
Well said. Thank you. So we've got about 12 minutes left. I would suggest we kind of take any kind of last comments on this substantive topic, invite written recommendations for priorities under this first theme prior to the next meeting, and kind of pick up there and close out this conversation and shift our focus now to logistics for the last 10 minutes or so. Any other comments or objections to that approach? Jake.
Yeah, not an objection. And hopefully this will be a quick last addition to the conversation. I just wanted to highlight the climate feed management action is just something to maybe have some further conversations around as it relates to this conversation about mitigation. And I was also curious because Brian, in your slides, there was the mention of, I think it was what, 0.1% of like organic matter, and the carbon impacts of that are very significant and cost effective. And so would you say that the nutrient management and amendments action does that like sufficiently overlap with that finding, or is there something more to be said about increasing soil organic matter? Like, are there strategies that we've yet to articulate or elevate here that would help us get there?
Yeah, I think I need Alyssa to weigh in on this one. I think it's a good discussion to have. I think nutrient management is definitely a way where we track implementation. You got to take soil tests, right? You can track organic matter through those soil tests. You're always planning for above a tolerable soil loss. So I think it's part of the strategy, and it's a potential way to track it. I think it's the whole suite of agronomic practices implemented together point towards the opportunity to raise that base sequestration rate. And I think that's kind of the tension in the inventory. The LELUCF and the aggregations for agricultural land use is different from the conservation practice implementation that has a discrete an additional benefit. So I think that needs to be ironed out, which strategy best reflects that, and maybe all of them together. But yeah, it's a great question, and something to identify what's the best way to get towards that rate of organic matter increase.
I can just add briefly, there's a number of strategies there that are listed that we know increase soil organic matter. And of course, it's like nuanced and different on every farm and every field, but there are general patterns. And I think that's what like Common is trying to get to as a kind of like a crayon basis, not like a nice detailed pencil, but it tells you like directionality and generally which practices will increase soil organic matter. And so the nutrient management planning doesn't explicitly, it's more directly that amendment piece of that strategy. But the grazing practices that increase cover and forage quality and rotational grazing, we know increase organic matter. The reduced tillage and vegetative cover ones would definitely increase organic matter. So we can kind of leave them as they are and prioritize the ones that we know increase organic matter, or maybe we could just rephrase them around that's one strategy is, in supporting farmers implementing practices that increase organic matter, and then list them. I don't know how detailed or nuanced we want to get, but
yeah,
there's a bunch of them.
That's what I'm curious is like, is it a question of framing? And would the committee be behind that of like saying like, that's a worthy, goal for the state is to really orient itself towards increasing soil organic matter, and here are the kind of elements in the climate action plan that we could identify as like moving towards that.
I want to hear from Andrew, but thanks for that conversation. And I'd encourage those of you who participated to kind of frame that up in your written comments, so we can kind of move that concept forward. So Andrew, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Billy. I know we're short on time, so I'll be real quick. First of all, Ryan, really appreciated that presentation. It was very helpful and really, really well done. I just, I'm coming at this mostly as a ecologist, a landscape ecologist, and so in terms of prioritizing things, I'm drawn to the the natural resource restoration practices type categories of priorities that were laid out there. And thinking a lot about the co-benefits of those practices, not only for mitigation, but obviously for resilience and biodiversity, connectivity, water quality, and realizing that I think we have to be really strategic about where and how we implement those practices so they can have maximize those co-benefits. And one example of that is utilizing, for example, the existing conservation design to make sure we're doing it in ways that all connect together. I also recognize that to do that, there has to be a way to compensate farmers for any lost production. So definitely thinking about payment for ecosystem services or other ways to compensate farmers has to be part of that conversation. I have some things in writing I'll submit, but I think in general, just for me, bringing it back to, how we can support farmers, how we can maximize those co-benefits in addition to doing the most mitigation we can based on the methodology that Ryan laid out there.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you for sharing that information in advance as well. Great. So got a few minutes left. What I would recommend is that for our next meeting, we start off with a quick opportunity for folks to ask questions and discuss the materials we'll send out related to all the updates that I rattled off at the beginning and the information from Ryan's presentation. And then we'll ask folks to provide their kind of prioritized lists or prioritized concepts for themes 1 and 2, maybe a week or some days before our next meeting on the 31st. Then we can compile that and try to push it back out to folks a few days before the meeting so you can digest it. And we'll spend the bulk of the meeting discussing those theme 1 and ideally theme 2 recommendations to see if we can kind of bubble up a priority list as a group and then take it from there. How does that sound as kind of some next steps? JL, you're good with that?
Yeah. I don't know if anyone, has a recommendation too, or something that would be more helpful. Please let us know.
Yeah. Exactly. I just put in the chat the kind of the 3 themes that we had previously discussed. That was in the email I sent out for this meeting. I'll send it all out again in follow-up for today. But the first one is the one we've been talking about a bit around reducing emissions. The second one is really relevant given our experience over the past week or so with another round of flooding at kind of peak cropping season, just the idea of supporting adaptation, viability, recovery, and economies related to our working in natural lands. So, and I think we have a lot of recommendations in the initial plan around those topics. So let's see. So our next meeting is Wednesday, the 31st. It's exactly 2 weeks from today. Would folks do you think by next Wednesday or Thursday, you'd be able to get, your written, kind of comments, priorities on these first two themes to Janelle and I, and then we can work to compile them and get them back out to folks early the week, that following week, so you had a few days to crunch on them before we meet on that Wednesday? Okay. Great, so let's go with, you think next, you could do it by the end of the day next Wednesday? All right, we'll give ourselves a week. So let's jot that down as your deadline. We'll send that out in an email with some further instructions. We'll get out all those supporting materials, all the materials related to the stuff we talked about. I will send out the more detailed progress tracker that I know some of you had an issue opening from a link. I'll send that out as just a static Excel file, so you have that too. And then I think as we're kind of identifying priorities, and if we have any questions or want a better status update on them, we can reach out to the folks implementing those and get that. Cool. Any other thoughts or comments from folks before we break? Okay. I do also want us to get our kind of July and September meetings on the calendar. I know Doodle can be annoying, but is that a tool that folks are willing to give another shot at for the August meetings? Okay, we'll try to push one of those out this week or early next, so that there's plenty of time, hopefully, to get ahead of folks' plans if possible. All right. Anything else we want to talk about? Any members of the public present who want to share any additional comments? All right. Any parting words, co-chair?
No, it was a good meeting. It was good to finally get into this a little bit. So
yeah, I agree. Great. And I think as we gear up for the next one, we're going to be in better shape doing some of this work in advance. So, and Evan, you'll hear from me soon to talk about how we're going to tackle this.
Yep, sure thing.
Great. All right. Well, thanks everyone for the good conversation. Ryan, thanks again for all that great information, and enjoy the afternoon, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, all. Bye.